Again, my name is Daniel Hebda. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at Mega, and I'm going to speak to one of my favorite topics. It's about the value of architecture. And I typically do this presentation from an enterprise architecture perspective. I've adapted a little bit today to be more focused on business architecture, but you'll see synergies in the presentation where it could apply really to either. So whether your architecture practice is business architecture by and of itself, or is enterprise architecture, or maybe you're working together, there should be some takeaways from this. So we'll get right into it. Anytime I'm speaking about the value of architecture, I think it's really critical to start to understand first and foremost, who is the value for? I have run into many lower maturity architecture practices, those that are just beginning, and they tend to mistake their own perception of what they believe is valuable related to their work. Let's say the work that maybe they're the most proud of. And that's not necessarily the work that's best received by different stakeholders to really understand the purpose and value of their work. So when we start with who the value is for, it lets us reframe that conversation. So at Mega, we have a concept, we call it noisy to influential. And the idea is to consider the value your EA practice delivers from the perspective of the stakeholder who is receiving your work product. And so we've done this, for example, at different conferences as a survey. And when we do that, we'll start by saying, how valuable is your EA practice? Is it noisy? Is it useful? Is it trusted? Is it influential? And immediately the majority of respondents go right to trusted or influential. And before they click the answer, we say, but one caveat, answer it as though we were asking the consumers of your work product. And then they switch towards noisy or useful. And that's what we're going to speak to today, is a little bit of clarifying that so that we can use it to our advantage, ensuring that the work we do is consumed as valuable. So if an architecture practice starts up, and let's say that the organization hasn't seen it before, or it's being rebooted and they're not really sure what to make of the new practice, it might be perceived by many as noisy. That is, they're not really sure what it's for, how it works, or how they could benefit. It's just something that's happening. So the idea is to quickly get to useful. We call this push mode because it often requires pushing information from your architecture practice out to willing stakeholders, show them the value of the work, talk to them about their needs, but it illustrates where you can support them and provide specific value. Once that happens, the word might spread. The different stakeholders might let other stakeholders know and say, hey, we worked with that architecture group and it was really useful. And as that word spreads, other groups will come to you asking for help. Often it looks like, hey, I heard you helped that other group. They had this problem. You clarified a vision. Can you help my group as well? And when you get to the stage where they're asking for your help, we call that pull mode. That's where it's trusted. That's where you've really developed a level of reputational trust within the organization. And then ideally, we continue to spread the value and the perspective on architecture, where the different stakeholders, they don't only come to you after a problem exists, but they really come to you at the beginning of a transformation. And they say, we're about to engage on this initiative. Let's go talk to the architects first, early in the process, what's often referred to as shifting left, and so that we can get their insight right from the beginning. And that's when you've made it to influential. Now, you may be looking at this and realize, well, my EA practice or my BA practice supports many different elements or stakeholders, and not everybody might see us the same way. Well, absolutely, that's true. So you can have many stakeholders for a given architectural service that you offer, or any architectural service you offer may have many different value perspectives that can be perceived. So you've got that many to many relationship of the services your practice offers and the stakeholders that consume it. So it's important that we assess and look at it from the lens of each of the stakeholders we interact with. For any given architectural service that our practice offers, how do the different stakeholders that we're working with see us? Noisy, useful, trusted, or influential? And then you can establish an aspirational target. So there may be certain stakeholders where really there's not synergy. There's not a priority. There's no need at the moment to work with them. And then they won't be on the sheet. Others perhaps see us as noisy, but there's a lot that they could gain from the architectural work. So let's get them on the path to useful. Others who maybe already see you as useful, let's move them to trusted, and so on and so forth. So really, it's one that can be assessed and established in a way to track and move progress so that you can really increase the perspective of value within the organization. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to talk to some tactics that we can use to help us move along this pathway. I tend to tell the story top down. That's not a requirement. Of course, you can start in many different places. It's just easier to illustrate in a top down style of story. And I've also used a specific example where I'm going to look at architecture working with software development. It's not required. It's just the example I chose for this presentation. You can fill in business optimization, business transformation, many different style of transformative initiatives that architecture can support. The other thing is I'll use a number of analogies and stories to try and illustrate the point. And I always welcome feedback. So after the presentation, either live through the questions, or if you're watching this on replay, feel free to send me an email to either help me enhance the storyline and or to ask certain questions. So let's jump into it. The first thing is if I want to offer and deliver real value as an architecture practice, then I'm going to help the organization clarify its vision for some of its future state, the transformation, if you will, starting with the mission, vision, strategy, high level things. And so I like this story. I came across it at a recent conference. It's not new, but it goes back to the 1960s where President JFK was touring NASA. And as he was going through the facility, he encounters a man with a broom. And he says to the individual, what are you doing? And the response was, well, Mr. President, I'm helping put a man on the moon. And the reason I like this story and this illustration is it shows the connectedness all the way from the highest level strategy of the organization down to every individual. The most granular action in the organization understands how they support that singular major goal or initiative. Now, on one hand, we can say that this is an easy example because putting a man on the moon was so critical, so monumental that everybody knew it. It was very clear. In today's complex organizations, there may be many different elements to the strategy, and that's actually where business architecture in particular, architectural practices in general, can really provide some support and helping take this vision, mission, the strategy articulation, and drive it down to provide clarity to the different operational elements. So if I do look at that and assume for a moment that an organization has a strategy, the architects may not be the ones who devise the strategy, but they can represent it and articulate it in a way that can be confirmed. And then if I look at an organization as a number of business lines or business units intersected by different job titles, I've got a couple of examples here like VPs and directors, managers, etc. Then I can see this grid that represents some of the way in which the organization is structured. Of course, it's a very simple example here. And we might imagine that if I take this strategy that I've articulated and I want the organization, such as putting the man on the moon, to be able to understand and fully articulate it, that I could just overlay that strategy, kind of like a nice blanket across the organization. Everybody would be on the same page. Everybody's marching in the same direction. No ambiguity, no disconnects. But of course, that's not exactly how it goes. Typically, what happens when we intersect the strategy communicated to these different business lines, business units, and the different job titles is it acts more like a cross-cut shredder. That as we play the telephone game of an executive passing the details of the strategy on to the different departments, divisions, etc., they each take the piece that they deem relevant to their work or their group, and they further dissect it and pass it on to the next, which again is further decomposed and dissected, which ultimately leaves the actual actions that need to take place to fulfill that strategy in unrecognizable format. It's somewhat too granular. And so here is an example where I think architecture can play a significant role in moving forward and clarifying this vision. And it's by devising a number of services that you offer to your organization. Again, I frame this in an enterprise architecture context, but you'll see that business architecture fits firmly in this. And I like a comment of the previous speaker that it's really important as you go through an architecture initiative to contemplate that question of why. And I'm going to frame that question even to the architecture practice itself. Why is there an architecture practice in the organization? Again, if I'm going to deliver recognizable value in a modern organization that maybe believes that they're too continuous or too agile to need architecture, I need to ask myself, why does the architecture practice exist? And so I have a conversational example. It's to align enterprise execution by design, the architecture, to the company strategy. And I've got an alternate way of framing it, and I'll explain why in a second. It's to continuously align the strategy and the operations, again, via the operating model. The reason I have the alternate expression is that in most cases, we're going to use architecture to help design a vision that enables the operating model to align to the strategy. But there are some cases where, in doing so, we recognize that there's a challenge or a problem with the strategy itself. And so we may need to raise a flag or an alert that indicates the strategy itself needs to be reframed or rearticulated, that it might not be achievable with the current budget, timeframe, resources, etc. So, moving into the example I mentioned, again, I'm borrowing the storyline of architects working with a modern software development team. And so I start with understanding some of the problem of that disconnect or that challenge so that we can frame it to a point where we can offer concrete value. Let's start with the different perspectives. So, first, how does that modern software team see themselves? Maybe hip, modern, cutting edge, fashionable, trendy. It's all at the very front of the transformation. And to some extent, there's a truth here. The work that the software developers are doing in the continuous improvement realm is quite impressive. The way that they can apply modern and new technologies to meet current market expectations is fantastic, and they deserve credit for that. As architects, we can't lose sight of it. But maybe, as the graphic illustrates, it's a little bit overstated, the degree to which it's trendy and hip. But how do architects view those same software teams? Maybe not quite as hip or trendy. Maybe we see some value. They're synchronized, they're working together, there's a coordination, but maybe they're not quite as cool or capable as they believe. Who's right? Well, there's a little bit of truth to both sides, but again, it's about reconciling the perspectives to ensure we can work together to deliver value. How about the other way around? How do architects see themselves? And again, I use the enterprise architect in this example because I find that there's a little bit more ego in the EA side than I do the business architects, who are a little bit more reasonable in the value and the work that they deliver. They see themselves a bit as Atlas holding up the world. Everything rests on their shoulders. It's all of the IT, it's all of the business design, all the way up and inclusive of business architecture. And again, not true in a literal sense. It's not quite that critical, but there is some real structural elements to architecture that are vastly important to keeping the organization running the way it does. And so they deserve some credit, but just maybe not quite as much as the picture illustrates. And how do the software teams see the architects? Well, in case it's not clear to those in the audience, the boot would be the architects. The software teams might see it as constraining, that the information provided by the architecture practices are too much detail, too much enforced, too rigid, too structured. And this is where we'll find business architecture really solves that problem, because business architecture lives in a space that isn't so rigid. It really is enabling and providing a value and assistance, and that's why I'm going to use that as an example, and it fits for the theme of this day's presentation and session. So let's go a little bit further on these perspectives, but let's put some context to it to see if we can't articulate it in a way that'll better illustrate how we can come to common ground where we can define value. So here's what it appears. At a first glance, we look at the way that I presented those images a moment ago, and it looks like we're at complete odds. We've got the modern agile software team trying to go in one direction, which is seen as high speed, agile, the pivoting. And then we've got the architectural side, which is seen as more rigid, more structured, slowing down, getting in the way. But the truth is that these two teams are actually working together towards the same goal. And we're going to help through architecture ensure that we're working to the same goal. So let's first, again, articulate that vision, that strategy in a way that we can all understand and agree upon. And then let's shift our perspective a little bit and realize that, you know what? We are actually all working together trying to achieve the same goal. And in some cases, that means we can provide architectural guidance to enable these modern and agile software teams. And in other cases, it's the agile development teams that have to realize that the architects, they're not there to get in their way, but they're there to provide guidance that will ensure that problems in the future don't occur, that we're really going to get on the smoothest pathway forward. So I'm going to jump into another analogy now, and it's a sports analogy. And don't worry if you're not heavy into sports. I myself am not a huge sports fanatic. As a matter of fact, I had to Google some of the stuff. So bear with me as we go through this. The way I look at agility in this analogy is to look at the single player on a particular sports team. And here I'm looking at American soccer, or I guess football, and most of the rest of the world. And we could imagine that that player has the ball and they have to run with some level of speed and agility to pivot throughout the field to get around obstacles in order to achieve the goal that they're looking to achieve, in this case, score on the other team. And in this example, we would expect that the player, as he's running down the field, would not want nor expect that another individual, absent the opposition, would get in his way. Specifically, that player would expect that his own teammates, or even more importantly, his own coaches, would not run on the field to create obstacles for his progress towards the goal. How do we see the architects in this analogy? Well, the architects need to look across the entire team, not just the individual player. So, for sure, agility is important within each of the individual players, but adaptability is more important as we look across the team. And that's recognizing the value of the agility of each player, but also orchestrating and coordinating the way in which they're going to work to achieve a greater outcome for the organization in total. So, here it's not about one player scoring, but rather the team winning. And the team winning means that the team does have to score, but the team also has to defend. And the team not only has to beat the current team this week, but has to beat next week's team and the week after, with the ambition of winning the season and then winning season after season. So there's a different expectation from the coaching perspective, which is really to pay attention to all of the different dynamics that are going on in the marketplace and enable the different players to have visibility into how their agile work fits into this bigger picture, what their needs might be, and how they can work together to drive a cohesive vision towards achieving the outcome that, in our example of reality, the organization expects. So, the architects are the coaches in my analogy, and the players are the agile development teams. And again, that could be business optimization, it could be a business transformation, it could be any number of different aspects of the organization that you're helping in transformation. So if they're the coaches in my analogy, that must mean that they are in charge, that everybody has to do what the architects say, right? No. Now, of course, it varies by organization, but generally speaking, that's not the case. And we need to avoid this reflex because the architects are trying to articulate strategy and present transformation in a manner that is good for the organization. It may be seen as though that they can simply dictate what will be and that's what will happen. But there are reasons why that can't be. And it's that, for example, architects don't have all the visibility of constraints that may exist beyond their purview. There may be many other reasons. So it's important the architects themselves recognize that it's a collaborative process. We work with the different stakeholders, or in my analogy, we work with the players to ensure that there's a positive back and forth. And this is where, if we define the services that we can offer as coaches to the players, the things that we can do for the team that they themselves will recognize as valuable, it defines a handoff and an expectation where that work comes together and can be recognized by each party as valuable. So here's an example of something that's an interesting trend. First, from an EA perspective, if you look at the graphic, there was this ivory tower notion, and it stemmed from that ego I mentioned earlier. Architects were in the ivory tower, they were dictating standards, everybody must do what they say, and of course, it didn't work well. The pendulum has swung too far to the right, where many architecture practices are now decentralized to a fault. And I think business architecture, in particular, working with the traditional enterprise architecture role, can balance this out and land us in the middle, where you see that federated approach that's listed as democratic. This is where there is a cross functional viewpoint in architecture that's not so detached as to become an ivory tower. And the solution to that for me is exactly business architecture. We can use business architecture tools to somewhat glue that strategy perspective into the more granular designs that architects can support using business architectural tools and practices. And that's what I'm going to get into now. So I'll start with business capabilities. We're going to use business capabilities from a business architectural perspective as one of the tools that's going to help us avoid that strategy shredder. So, what are capabilities? I like to use a human example, and I've given this portion of a presentation before. So, again, for those of you in the audience, if you have feedback, I always welcome it. And in the human example, I use the concept of the ability to walk or run. We could call it human bipedal locomotion, for example. And I've illustrated a life cycle across the graphic. And you can see at the far left with what I'll call, let's say, the infant. They can't yet walk, so they don't yet have that capability. But soon, when we get to toddler level, the ability to walk or run begins, and it carries through with a high level of stability towards the end of the life cycle. So, business capabilities are stable. They last a long time, and this in and of itself provides value in that it's a good basis for transformation because we're not changing the concept of the capability very frequently. Then we can have conversations about it. We can come up with standard language, for example. This uses an example from the BA Guild, their common reference model. And you can see that if we clearly articulate the different capabilities across the organization, we come up with a common, clear description that's well defined and well understood, then as needs arise for transformation, we can use the capability language to speak to that transformation need. So I've highlighted one example in brand targeting. If there was a lapse in our ability to execute and the strategy had an area that could be improved by changing brand targeting, we can speak to it, get everybody on board, clearly march in the same direction, and again, achieve significant value in doing so. All right, so we have this common understanding, it's stable, it lasts a long time. So what? Why do we care and how do we use this to add value? Well, there's several ways in which we can do that, but I'm going to start with one of my favorite is unconstrained thinking. Focusing on the question of what, abstracting the architecture at a layer that allows for consistent communication across all of the different departments and roles allows me to think differently about the problem space. So when I'm looking at the strategy and the goals that the organization is trying to achieve, instead of being constrained by how things are operating or implemented today, I can look at it at a capability perspective and say, well, how could this be done in general? Is there a better way that could be done? Can I really think differently about the issue? And so when you consider the what at the capability level, independent from the how, where the people, process, information, or technology exist, you can come up with different solutions that may be more creative. That's not to say that constraints won't ever come into play. Of course, as you start looking at the feasibility of the different solutions, you'll consider the constraints that are in place. But I find organizations that focus too much on the constraints first inadvertently constrain themselves beyond necessary, limiting their ability to transform in a way that offers value. So, take it a little further, if we look at that same notion and trying to be creative and come up with different solutions, if I were to just ask individuals in an organization for ideation, maybe a suggestion box style of example, I may get a whole slew of different suggestions that may or may not be relevant to the current strategy for the organization. So, business architecture and using at this point capabilities can also give me a frame of reference for that creativity. It gives me context so I can really refine the ideation and the thinking that goes on and solicit ideas for a specific realm or purpose. So, instead of generally saying, how could we as an organization improve? I might say that there's an issue in order processing. How could we better handle the quantity of influx of orders, or how could we better respond to customer needs? And I could get even more granular than that while still staying at an abstract what level. So I find this to be a great way of considering some of the value in business architecture. So let's come back to the capability example of ability to walk or run. And let's also recognize that there's another element to capabilities that can be immensely valuable in providing value to an organization, but also to helping us stitch that strategy perspective down into the vision for operating model. And that is the ability to measure those capabilities at different points in time. So again, if I look at my capability line here, it's introduced at the toddler, and it goes for the entire life cycle of the individual pictured. I might say, well, what would be the speed or the stamina or the stability of that individual at different points in time? Of course, the speed of the toddler would be low relative to the teen or the adult. The stamina might be incredible. The kids tend to be like little batteries running around. I wish I had that energy. And stability is probably mixed. They're a little uneasy on their feet at the toddler age. And as we progress through teen up towards adult, speed may increase, stamina for sure will increase, stability increases, and further down again, it may change how we measure speed, stamina, and stability. Well, in the same way as we're looking for creative solutions or to frame different problem statements related to the strategy and goals, we can start to contemplate What would that mean as it relates to the way in which we choose to measure the capability in the future? So if I'm running at a certain speed today, at a certain stamina, a certain stability, and I have a goal that requires a different level of any of those, let's say speed and stamina, then I can plan for what would it take to achieve that in 6 months, in 1 year, maybe in a shorter duration, depending on the speed of your transformations, in a week, in a month. Also, if I consider back to my analogy of soccer or again football, depending on where you're from, how would the capabilities of the goalie differ from that of the center forward or striker? And again, remember, if you're not familiar with sports, don't worry, I had to look that up. So let's think of it as defense versus offense. If you're trying to stop the opposite team from scoring a goal, which capabilities may be required, versus if I'm trying to actively score on the other team, what capabilities may be required, and then how might I measure them today versus tomorrow? Let's assume for a second that I do that measurement of today and I assess that, you know what, on the offensive side, the speed is really behind where it needs to be in order for us to win. Then I can do things like drills to improve a particular capability, increase my speed such that I have a greater chance of winning. But the issue, and this one cracked me up as I was working on this presentation, the issue with drills by themselves or focusing on capabilities by themselves, if you don't put them in the context of their use, if you don't illustrate how capabilities come together to produce a greater value, you might miss out on the purpose of the evolution of the capability that you're planning. So true story, my son was playing on the basketball team, and again, I'm not a sport fanatic, and the coach is going through doing a number of drills, and it's not clear to me how this drill translates to the game. And I've seen some coaches where they conduct the drills and you hop in the game, and there really isn't a connective element. And then some coaches where they're really able to articulate that you perform the drill, you improve on that capability, and then the coach shows you how that capability improved by that drill is functional in the game itself. And this is the next tool from business architecture that we're going to use to avoid that strategy shredder to ensure that we can provide articulable, clear value to an organization. And that's called value streams. And so if I look at the concept of a value stream, quoting from Forrester here, there is a problem that it can help us solve. Business leaders see development, I'm using the software development analogy still, as a black box. They might not fully understand all that's going on within those agile teams, how it works, why it works, where it's going, why it's going. And there is a level of that operational element that maybe isn't important for the business leaders to see, but understanding the direction is. And we can use value streams as a reference point to support this. Similarly, and maybe to some extent in terms of value of architecture, more importantly, those development teams maybe don't have a clear understanding of where the organization's going, or more specifically, how their work is going to help move the organization in that direction. Going back to the strategy shredder, if they're holding on to that little piece of paper, they might not fully comprehend how that's helping the organization move in the way that it needs to move. And we're going to help resolve that. So, a quick example of a value stream, the content for this illustration comes again from the BA Guild. And I'm looking at here a value stream for loan acquisition. We can see that there would be a trigger at the left. There's a number of value stages that will occur that ultimately together produces a value stream, which will result in value. And when we define a value stream, we're looking at that value as a value proposition. What is the proposal for value that would be achieved by a stakeholder or a customer who is going to benefit from the execution of the value stream? Similarly, here, we're bringing together at each of those value stages the different capabilities that are needed to enable that value stage. So within receive application, you can see below it the list of capabilities, validate application, etc. And perhaps in my strategy, I've got an issue identified that there's a problem with the loan acquisition value stream. It's just there's dissatisfaction and it comes down to the eligibility component. So I can look at the approved loan value stage. I can see the capability for agreement eligibility determination, and I can do the metric assessment I mentioned earlier. How many approvals are we able to issue? How rapidly can we determine eligibility? How accurate, if we do follow up, has the eligibility determinations been? And we could then solicit again ideas on architecturally what could be done to improve that capability such that we can strengthen the value of this value stream. So it really brings it together the same way that the coach can take the drills that improve capabilities and inject how it applies to the game. We can take the capabilities of the organization, organize them under value items, value stages here, so that we can articulate how it's going to help in achieving of the strategy and the goals of the organization. So some quick method examples borrowed from Gartner. If I look at the right, it's illustrated as circles. So of course we identify the customer and the value proposition. And I'm going to speak a little bit more to that in just a moment. We can then identify the steps of the value stream, the value stages themselves, which capabilities would be needed to implement or support those value stages. And then we can use that to plan for the transformation and optimization of the service and operating models. And again, this is where we can provide that glue from strategy down into the more granular elements of architecture so that we can avoid the strategy shredder. We can articulate clear value from the architecture practice that supports the transformation of an organization. So in green at the left, you can see value streams socialize knowledge across functional silos of how business capabilities interact to drive value to customers. The most important aspect of that quote for me is across the different silos. They can be functional silos, they can be departmental silos. One of the key elements of business architecture and value streams in particular is that ability to cut across any of those different silos of the organization. Immensely, immensely valuable. Taking this further to the next level, we can then look at those different elements and we can start to map the different people, process, technology, and information to those different capabilities underpinning the different value stages of the value stream. And then we can start to look for then how well fitted it is. That goes back to the measurement on the capability. If that capability is underperforming and I can understand how it's implemented by the people, process, information, and technology, I can start to plan for transformation and changes that will bring the performance of that capability up to the level needed, such that when in conjunction with other capabilities will enable the value stream. And so here again, a quote from Gartner, a value stream can be used to identify, analyze, and determine, I say people, process, information, and technology required in digital platforms to enable and drive the organization's future state operating model and its supporting processes. So it really is an element that's going to help balance architecture, keep it connected to that strategy vision that will increase the value of the entirety of the architecture practice, business and enterprise architecture, all the way down to different elements of operational execution. That could be software development, again, optimization, business transformation, whatever it might need to be. So back to that shredder element, imagine now that we can take this clarity. We can look at that articulation all the way from the strategy down to the different value streams and elements, looking at the capabilities, the linkages of those capabilities to the people, process, information, and technology, and then we can work with these different audiences and say, for example, if there's a software team who's given a task to implement a feature or functionality of a different product within the organization, they might have resource constraints. And as they're pivoting in their agile and continuous mode, if we can give them a frame of reference for where their shredded piece of paper fits into the bigger picture, they can revalidate and assess as they pivot if that pivot is moving them in the right direction towards the strategic outcome that's being targeted. Without that level of business architectural visibility, these pivots may put them in a place that actually deviates from the intended outcome. And I've seen this. This happens many times. For example, a project may be designed to implement a particular technology. It's a little less common today, but let's say in the Big Bang style of IT deployment, we've taken this complex technology and again resource constraints that could be calendar, individual, financial, etc. They make certain decisions. They're pivoting on the schedule to stay on time and on budget, and in doing so they leave off elements of deployment of this technology they didn't realize were the core aspect of what the strategy was calling for. And so I've seen parties thrown by IT operations elements who celebrate the successful deployment of this new technology, not realizing that it's a miss from a strategy perspective. So, using business architecture, value streams, and capabilities can help maintain that visibility and alignment. Following in the software example, again, I like this example, and it's actually old. It's been around for many years now from Spotify, and that's the balance between alignment and autonomy. So you can imagine in today's high speed transformation world, you need high levels of autonomy. If there's a rigid hierarchical structure where every decision needs to go up the ladder to get approval before it can get back down and anybody can change, you just can't move fast enough. But you risk with high autonomy that the chance that there's misalignment, that individuals are moving in all sorts of random directions. And so, again, borrowing from Spotify here, you can see that if we want high autonomy and high alignment, then we can frame an abstracted reference. We need to cross the river in this example. That's the what that can be articulated in value streams and capability models, and allow others to define the implementation of how that will be achieved. Once they know the metrics that they're looking for, the evolution that's being planned, there's a level of guardrail or constraint that's non prohibitive that lets them work together so we can stay aligned without being non autonomous. And so I found this graphic to be very appealing to this storyline because it really resonates in the need for autonomy and how business architecture in particular can help us sustain that alignment. So just to revisit the graphic, looking in the perspective here, again, if I understand the value stream, the value propositions, the different value stages, and the capabilities that support them, I can use this as the alignment mechanism that's articulating what we need to do without constraining, without removing the autonomy of the different teams throughout the organization that are going to deliver on how we actually do it. So, how do I come up with a value proposition? This, of course, might be a common question coming out of a value stream perspective. And I like to use the notion of think of the products within the organization, because the products that you develop, and that could be goods or services, or of course, combinations of goods and services, they're put forth by your organization in order to articulate and deliver value to some customer, internal or external. So if you're looking to say, well, what are the value propositions that I might need value streams for? I like to start from the products, review the products, look at them. And this again, bidirectionally valuable. I can start to create value streams to understand better what products are offered. I can also assess products as to what are the value streams that are going to support them and whether the value is sufficient for the market segment it supports. Full circle, coming back to where I started from in terms of the noisy to influential, your architecture practice itself should articulate the services they offer as architectural products, and you should define and articulate the value. And again, that's in the context of different stakeholders or consumers of that product. So it's not only architecting for the organization, the products that you maybe sell, and the value offered to your customer in different market segments, but also your architectural practice itself. What are the products that that practice offers? Who are the stakeholders consuming those products? And do they recognize that value as noisy, useful, trusted, or influential? So, finishing now with just gluing some of the pieces back together. If I want to bring it to how this can all work cohesively to ensure that there's value in an organization, and just to reiterate, I use software development here as an example. It applies to any of the operational elements within an organization. So we've got the enterprise vision, the strategy that can be articulated by the architects. That articulation of architecture then can be then aligned to the different value streams that will result in a definition of capability enhancement, the evolution to the capabilities needed to achieve the future state that fulfills the strategy. That guardrail established by the capability enhancements can be used to frame in a non-constraining manner, just a guiding manner that shows where we're trying to go, not how we're going to do it, to, in this case, again, the software development teams who can ensure that as they pivot and execute the different sprints, that they revalidate their pivots are still in line with that capability enhancement, supporting of the value stream that ultimately rolls up to the strategy. And they don't, in this case, need to have a concrete understanding of the entirety of every aspect of the strategy. But seeing with the value stream perspectives and the capability enhancements that are needed gives enough frame of reference that as they again are making decisions at the edges in a more autonomous manner, they can stay aligned. If I look at the example of the sport analogy, that we are looking to enable these players. We're looking to define ways in which they can achieve their outcomes in orchestration or alignment with the rest of the team so that the entire team achieves their outcomes. And this can be through capability enhancement, like working on speed and agility. It could be ensuring they have the right materials and resources. In this case, it could be the footwear, for example. And we have to resist the temptation of getting in the way. There are reasons by which an agile player may pivot in a way that's outside the scope of the originally defined play. And we have to work with that player after the fact to reconcile why that happened and look to provide guidance to keep everything as best functioning as possible. Enable, 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 enable. This is one, especially for the enterprise architects who might be on the call. It must be seen that we are supporting the different players. Again, agile development, business transformation, whatever it might be. We are not there to dictate exclusively standards. That doesn't mean, by the way, we can't articulate standards, but it's not about the standard. It's about how the standard will help enable the organization to move more rapidly in a more cohesive fashion with a higher chance of success, with a greater degree of strategic outcome, and in a way that ideally gives us the best ability to continue to provide value to our customers without inadvertently creating architectural debt by not working with the different operational teams. So, a little bit of a graphic to illustrate the different layering that can occur. We can see up at the top level, and it's illustrated by the graphic at the right, that these are a little bit more stable. The articulation of the business objectives, the definition of the value streams and capabilities. We might factor in some of the regulatory elements, especially if you're contemplating moving into a new marketplace. And of course, research on emerging technology, standards, patterns, and best practices. This is something that is ongoing, but isn't quite as dynamic as the next level where you can see the individuals jogging. Here's where we're putting together different architectures. We're going to define and illustrate the enablers so that we can make sure the organization can achieve the goals that they're looking to achieve. And then ultimately at the bottom, we can see the individuals running. This is where a lot of the continuous change is happening. The things are moving very quickly, and we need to work in an enabling and supporting fashion, reconciling where necessary things that come out of emergent changes, and then organizing and rolling it all back up and continuing the cycle. I assume everyone in the presentation today understands architecture is not a singular deliverable. It's an ongoing practice that continues to deliver value by looking at the different aspects that I've mentioned today. And so for the conclusion, then we'll open it up for any questions that may exist here. And I will reiterate that I'm also very open. If you want to send email to have follow-up conversations after the fact, please feel free to do so. We are going to use architecture and the architecture practice to unify the organization, to deliver value, to avoid that strategy shredder. We're going to do that at different paces, understanding the importance of the different roles. In particular, the business architecture, providing that clarity of vision through stable elements like value streams and capabilities that can be used for increased creativity as well as pivoting alignment so that we have autonomy without losing that alignment. The architect's role, again, is to provide clarity on bringing operations, the enterprise operating model, into alignment with the strategy. And we need to work together with clearly articulable handoff points so that everybody who's involved would come back and recognize that, yes, there's value in working with the architecture team, expectations are met, and everyone's on the same page. I hope you found the presentation interesting today. Again, I welcome all sorts of feedback. And so my email's on the screen. Very welcome to send me any kind of question, topic, or just general feedback. And I'd be more than happy to entertain a conversation. Thank you very much. And bear with me as I look to return to the window. All right. Bryce, you're muted. I can't hear you, sir.
I was on mute. Thanks, Daniel.
Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. Excellent. Thank you.
So I wanted to ask some really practical questions. I've been in organizations that, I've gone in and you see the business architect is sometimes viewed like you have that sort of as the dictator, dictating standards, trying to control things on one side. And on the other side, I've seen some people view them almost as order takers, where they're in the silos, right? Have you run across this, and how have you handled this, like politically, and get them to that mindset from a decentralized kind of worldview to one where they're more strategic?
So, great question. Probably one of the biggest challenges that we do find at many organizations. So, the way I like to start that articulation is to have open conversations. And it's going to sound super obvious, but I find that when those problems exist, the ivory tower or the order taker is there's no active dialogue from either the architects, and in this example today, more importantly, the architects, but even from the stakeholders. And so that's why I like to frame the articulation of what is the product or service we as the architecture practice are offering. What is it that we believe can be valuable to the organization? And listen to the stakeholders. Do they agree that there's value there? Because if there's no agreement on value, then there's going to be a major disconnect that will never reconcile. So I would start with that, having an open conversation around defining services that the architectural practice can offer.
And the second question is around defining those services. Is there and I love the way you had that kind of crawl, walk, run model. Is there any guidance in terms of maturity, like stages that we need to go through to get there, or do you just do it all at once?
No, for sure, there's stages and it differs by organization. So I find that it's going to be what is the talent and the skill of the architecture team? What is the recognition and awareness of the stakeholders? And you'll choose different services to employ based on that. But absolutely, it is a crawl, walk, run. It is not all at once. I encourage organizations to even contemplate, especially if they have a business architecture practice, to consider defining an architectural capability model in support of the different services they offer. And I'll give you a quick example that's more from an EA space, but it'll hopefully
Yep.
make the point. IT portfolio management, sort of the very low level entrance for EA.
Yep.
You can look at it as two core elements: the IT portfolio and a capability model that's used for the rationalization of the technologies. I go to some organizations, they have a capability model and they're struggling with the inventory. Others, they have the inventory, but they're struggling with the capability model. Obviously, I would take a different approach for each customer as to how to bring them up to speed, focusing on their gaps to make sure that they can deliver on the value. Trying to succeed where one of those two pieces is missing is guaranteed failure.
So my next question is around capability modeling. Really important and really fundamental to what you're talking about. And there's two parts to this really. One is around finding reference models. You referenced the BA guilds. They have a whole bunch of models there, and that is really useful. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on using something like that versus, there's other models that are sort of as a starting point, a little bit more proprietary, right? And then the other part to that is using tools to do that. How important that is in your view?
So, as a tool vendor, I find tools to be very necessary. I have to add that, and there's reasons why, from an efficiency perspective. For anyone who's on the presentation today, of course, there's elements
Yep.
of scale of initiative and resource availability, et cetera. But generally, I find the tools important. The other question, I like this question, and I sometimes get flack for it. There's certain groups who don't like the industry models for capability models and such. I do, with one caveat: recognize that it's a tool to help accelerate your starting, to help you learn how to define capabilities, how to frame them, to see some general best practices, but make it your own. Don't blindly accept an industry model and apply it. And so, whether you take one that's proprietary, one from an industry standard group, one from wherever you might find it, whatever it is, make it your own, learn from it. You may even find that you can find a few and together looking at them start to say, yeah, I do that and I understand why they're framed this way. That makes sense. Maybe that one doesn't make sense for us. And but don't accept it as that if I'm in such, banking industry, for example, and the standard model has this, that I must have every capability. So the only caution I have there is just make it your own.